Hi everyone, I'm Katherine from katherinesewing.com and welcome back to my channel. Today's video will be all about how I made this lovely breastfeeding friendly shift dress using a beautiful wool fabric from Burnley and Trowbridge and a self-drafted pattern. This was my first time making anything with a breastfeeding specific accessible opening, and it was definitely a learning experience, so stay tuned to the end of the video to see what my thoughts were on this project. The first section will be about how I drafted the pattern. The second section will be about how I sewed the dress. So if this sounds interesting to you, then keep on watching. Okay, so before I jump into this video, I just wanted to let you know that this video will be completely time-stamped in the description. So if any one section is more interesting to you, then feel free to just jump ahead to that particular section. Okay, so the concept for this dress was inspired by 50s and 60s sort of classic, more straight fit dresses. Specifically, I wanted a dress that was a little more casual, more loose fitting, that I could just wear, you know, that's just loose when you, on those days when you just want something a little more slouchy, but it's still something that I made myself and something that I feel happy about. Now, I didn't necessarily completely succeed with being happy with it, but it was a learning experience. Most shift dresses have higher necklines, and as a breastfeeding mother, the main problem for me with higher necklines is that I can't breastfeed in them because I need to either have a lower neckline or a button opening or a shirt that I can pull up, something like that. So I knew that this was a perfect project to practice adding a breastfeeding accessible hidden zipper or something of that sort. Specifically, I wanted to try out the breastfeeding type of feature where you have a shoulder princess seam, which obviously goes right over the bust, and within that seam you have a hidden zipper. Hidden zippers or invisible zippers they just look like a seam, so it really is a perfect type of zipper to use for a breastfeeding accessible opening. So as I mentioned earlier, I used a lovely wool fabric from Burnley and Trowbridge, which I highly recommend. I've made one other project with this type of fabric before. It was a lovely pleated skirt, and I just love this skirt. It's very, very soft. It feels and looks a lot like linen. I've been wearing it all through the summer. It's very cool, and so it really just busts all those typical myths about wool fabric. Okay, so as I usually do, I did self-draft this pattern. I'm going to get into later some issues with this process, but right now I'm just going to explain to you how I did it. So if you're interested in drafting your own patterns, the main place to start is by drafting your own custom dress blocks. A dress block is basically just a very basic pattern for a fitted dress that you then can trace off and change. Like, you could add an A-line skirt, you can lower the neckline, you can change the dart position, you can add princess seams, that kind of thing. So I had a dress block which was for a one-piece loose fitting dress, and I'd already drafted that a long time ago to my own measurements. So I started by tracing off both the front and the back for that dress block. So now it was time to make changes to the pattern. I usually like to start with the front since that usually is the most important. So first step was changing the position of the dart. As you can see, this dart started right next to the neckline, and I needed it to be in the middle of the shoulder seam. As you'll see in a moment, I actually should have waited on this step until after I'd altered the neckline, but more on that later. The reason for moving the dart is that the dart control, although there's not going to be a dart in the finished dress, the dart control will still be present within that princess seam. And since the princess seam was going to be coming from the shoulder seam, we need to move that dart into the shoulder seam, and then it will be in just the right position to just turn it into a princess seam. So I rotated my dart and I drew in my princess seam, and then I altered my neckline. So the way I did this was I just folded the paper pattern to close up that princess seam so I could see exactly how everything lined up before drawing on my neckline. I wanted a very wide but still high neckline. Now after doing this, I did realize that the position of the shoulder seam had now completely changed. It was just over here. So of course I had to move that princess seam again, just pivot it over so it would still be coming out of the shoulder seam. Now one more change I did to the shoulder was that I dropped the shoulder seam by about 1 centimeter, and I also lowered the armhole because my dress blocks have pretty high arm size, they come up pretty high, and I just wanted a more casual fit, so I did lower that. And as for the length of this dress, I wanted it to be just above my knee, just measured up the appropriate distance to make it be an above the knee length. So I followed these exact same steps for the back pattern, except that the back pattern in the loose fitting dress block doesn't have a dart at all. So all I had to do was just draw in the princess seam and line it up with the position of the princess seam on the front block. I also drew in the neckline, making sure to line it up with the position of the neckline on the front pattern. Now, one crucial mistake that I made at this point was forgetting to do something very important to do with the neckline. Whenever you are lowering a neckline on a pattern, it will, unless you do this alteration, it will kind of gape and not sit flush against the body. And a neckline should always be sitting flush against the body unless it's some sort of cowl neck garment, which of course this wasn't. So the solution for this is to just dart out some extra fabric from this area. Usually you dart it out into an existing dart or something of that nature. I completely forgot to do this. My drafting skills were feeling a bit rusty at this point, so I completely forgot. And as this was just meant to be a quick project, I didn't make a mock-up, and so this mistake was not caught until I finished the dress. Now in terms of the sleeves, I just wanted a basic straight sleeve, so I just traced off the sleeve pattern that corresponds to these dress blocks, and I did make the top curve of the sleeve a bit more shallow. As you'll see, I should have actually made it even more shallow than I did, but more on that later. And I made it into a short sleeve. Finally, I created some neckline facings just by tracing off the neck area of both the front and the back, and then tracing in the bottom line of the facing. And of course, I added all my seam allowances to my pattern pieces. This is optional, but I prefer to do it because it saves time during the fabric cutting phase. Okay, so when it came time for cutting out all my pattern pieces, I had my fabric, which was pre-washed, dried, and pressed flat. I had it on my table, and I believe I had it folded in half before I traced off my pieces and cut them out using rotary cutter and scissors where necessary. And as I mentioned before, I did have enough left over to make some cuffs, so I just traced off the width of the sleeve and then added enough length to make a cuff that would be able to fold up and have enough to be hemmed as well. Okay, so when it came time to sewing, as you'll know if you watch any of my channel, I don't have a serger and I prefer to use my vintage sewing machine, which only does a straight stitch. So when it comes to sewing all my garments, I either have to do felled seams or French seams in order to hide those raw edges. So I stitch up the back princess seams using French seams. So you first sew the raw edges to the outside of the garment. You trim them very narrowly, press it, and then you sew the seam again so that the seam will be on the inside of the garment. Then I stitch the sleeve, so I just attach the cuff to the sleeve, again using a French seam, and then I sewed the side seams of the sleeve and then did my hem. I did have to leave my bust line princess seams open because I would later be adding my invisible zippers into that area, and I wanted to finish the seam after the zippers were already in place. So I used 9-inch invisible zippers for this project, which I found on Amazon. I found a handy pack which included gray and nude colored invisible zippers, so I used the gray because it tied in with the light blue color of my fabric. Now in hindsight, it would have been better to use 12-inch long invisible zippers, and the reason for this is something you'll see a bit later. So when it was time to add my invisible zippers into the bust line princess seam, I first marked the placement vertically wise on the seam where I wanted the zippers to begin end to end. Then I used my tailor's chalk to just mark the exact stitching line, so 1.5 centimeters in from the raw edge. That way I would know exactly where to stitch for the invisible zipper. Then I used my invisible zipper foot and added my invisible zipper by stitching very, very closely to those zipper teeth with the help of the foot. So after this was done, then I sewed the rest of the seam, so just above where the zipper began and then below all the way to the bottom of the dress. And I did this with French seams again. But after this was done, I loosely just tried on my dress, and I didn't like the way the zippers looked, especially because the zipper pull was kind of at an awkward point. It was about right here, so it was quite visible. It would have been better if it was up higher on the dress. And I was also just unhappy with the way the fabric kind of bunched up. It was quite visible where the zipper began and ended. And so I decided that this was the fault of the zippers just being too short. So I got some 12-inch invisible zippers and I attempted to unpick the seams that held these zippers in place. However, due to me using a pretty small stitch length, it was nearly impossible to unpick these seams, especially without ruining my fabric. And eventually I just looked at it again and I realized I would just have to live with these zippers. So I fixed the seam as best as I could. Obviously I had to re-sew the areas that I'd picked out, but then I fixed the points at the beginning and the end of the zipper just to make it look a little more smooth of a transition. And I am happy with how it turned out, especially for my first time doing this kind of sewing maneuver. So after these front princess seams were finished, I could sew the side seams, the shoulder seams, and then add my neckline facing. So in order to make my facing, I'd simply stitch the front facing to the two back facings, and then I bound the raw edge with some white fabric tape to finish it. And then I just added it onto the neckline of the dress, right side to right side, sewed it, and then pressed it, trimmed and clipped that seam, and then I understitched. Understitching is where you simply sew the seam allowance to the facing or the lining of the garment, and this just helps the seam remain invisible from the outside and it helps everything stay flat. Then I was able to add my sleeves. So I did actually use French seams for the sleeves as well. This is something that the first time I tried it, it was probably a couple of years ago, seemed really intimidating and I wondered if it was even possible to add sleeves with French seams, but it actually is completely possible. It's just the same as sewing sleeves normally, it's just that you have to do it twice. So you first sew the sleeve seam very narrowly, like not with your full seam allowance, and then you press it, you trim it, and then you sew it again. And it really makes a nice durable seam and it looks nice and you don't have to worry about finishing the edges with a serger or a zigzag. Then it was time to add a center back zipper. At this point I was getting kind of tired and I wondered if it was possible to just close the center back seam and be able to pull this dress on over my head. But I decided it was pulling it too close. I don't think I would have been able to get this dress on and off just pulling it over my head. So I would have to use a zipper, and the zipper I had on hand was not an invisible zipper, it was just a standard zipper. And I wanted to hide it in some way. So I decided this was also a good time to practice adding a lapped zipper, which I'd never really done before. I'd done it once on a pillowcase, but never in a garment. So a lapped zipper is simply where the zipper is sewn in and there's kind of a flap of fabric that goes over top of it so you can't see it from the outside of the garment. So I found a helpful YouTube tutorial on how to do this, but I must say, I think most YouTube videos tutorials of how to do certain sewing maneuvers can sometimes make it seem a lot more intimidating than it actually is, at least to my perspective, because I'm a person who tends to just do a lot of things by eye and I'm not too careful about measuring. And this video made it seem like you have to be so precise and you have to have a special ruler and press everything perfectly and serge your edges first and blah, blah, blah. And I was quite intimidated, but then when I actually did it, I was like, oh, this is really easy. So that's just a bit of motivation for you if you're feeling scared about trying something because YouTube makes it seem super difficult. Once you actually do it, you might find it's not as hard as you think. So once the zipper was complete, I was quite happy with how it turned out. And I sewed the rest of the center back seam at the bottom below the zipper. And then I just felled that seam in order to finish it rather than doing a French seam. Oh, and I'd also like to mention how I finished the raw edges with the invisible zippers at the bust line. So I learned a handy trick about how to finish invisible zippers from actually a beautiful handmade dress that I bought from someone I follow on Instagram, and I saw how she finished her edges and I was like, oh, that's very clever. So you have your invisible zipper already sewn in place, and then there's raw edges, of course, underneath where the zipper is. And you simply take the raw edge of fabric and you fold it underneath the zipper tape, and then you stitch it just to the zipper tape, not to the actual garment itself. You isolate the zipper tape and that edge from the rest of the garment, and you just sew it folded under to the zipper tape. So I found that very clever solution for this. And finally, the last step was hemming this dress. So I wanted to keep it simple, and I did have some horsehair braid on hand, which I was excited to try for the first time. It was 2-inch wide horsehair braid. I didn't want to bother with adding a hem facing, so I simply just folded up the bottom of the skirt and enclosed the horsehair braid within that and stitched it down. After trying on the dress, I realized I probably used up a little too much fabric in this hem and the dress ended up a little too short, but that's okay. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how this dress fits and what I think about it. Honestly, I'm not extremely pleased with this dress. This honestly has had to be kind of an exercise in sewing humility and realizing that not every project will turn out wonderfully. And sometimes we need to do those projects that just aren't too great in order to fuel us forward and keep us learning. And this was one of those projects for me. Of course, the main issue that I already mentioned was that the neckline gapes, and you can see when I'm wearing it that it really does kind of stand out for my body, especially at the shoulders. Now the shoulders had a double issue because the neckline gapes, but it also sticks up more because the curve of the top of the sleeve came up too high considering how dropped the shoulder was, and that just makes it kind of stick up too much. So I do have an idea for an alteration, a way I could fix this in the future if I chose to, which would be unpicking the top of this sleeve seam and then just pulling up that extra sleeve fabric and shortening the, the steepness of the sleeve curve, and then basically converting it into more of an off-shoulder garment. So that way it would kind of pull down on the neckline, make it a bit wider, and that would pull out some of the gaping, and it would also fix the extra fabric in the sleeve. The skirt of the dress is a little on the short side, especially at the back, so I might potentially unpick the hem and do it again, but I could also wear this dress under another skirt that's longer, and kind of the dress would just look like a shirt that's tucked in, so I might wear it that way too. Also, this project was really an exercise for me in realizing my own personal style and realizing that I don't have to wear every single silhouette if it doesn't appeal to me. So as you'll know if you've watched my channel, I really do like the fit and flare silhouette where it's tight fitted on the top all the way to your waist and then the skirt flares out. I just find that is the most flattering for my body type. But again, it was that exercise in trying new things and seeing what works for me. And I really realized that the shift dress silhouette just isn't the most flattering for me. It tends to accentuate my bit of mummy tummy and it just doesn't, I don't find it looks as nice. So I think if I do wear this, I'll always wear it with a belt cinched around the waist just to make it look a bit nicer to my taste. If I were to make this again, I think I would also just finish the neckline with a bias tape facing rather than an actual facing, just to make it a little more smooth and streamlined and to eliminate that extra step. So I hope this helped some of you who are mothers or maybe thinking about being mothers or going to be mothers in the future and breastfeeding and so on and so forth. Okay guys, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, leave comments and questions below, check out the accompanying blog post which will be linked in the description. You can sign up for my weekly newsletter there. All of my links for social media are in the description, and thanks so much for watching guys, and I'll see you soon. Bye!